So I've recently published quite a large-scale study, and I'm going to talk to you about a bit more detail about this study, because our aim was to address a lot of the limitations in the literature, and we think we did so quite successfully. So it's quite an important finding, I think. Okay. Now, our study used a large group of children called the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children. So this is otherwise known as Allspark. So what happened was that in 1991, a group of researchers in Bristol decided that they were going to try and collect a large amount of data from mothers and babies and see if they could track them over a long time. So they recruited about 14,000 women who were pregnant and who had an expected delivery date of towards the end of 1991 and the beginning of 1992. And they took a massive amount of information from them. So they asked the mothers to fill in questionnaires, they asked them if they could take medical samples, they took blood samples, they took hair clippings, they took a whole lot of information from the mothers. Then when the baby was born, they went back to visit them again and took a massive range of information. And then every year since, they've been following them up and sending them questionnaires, asking about a whole range of information. So asking about their health, asking about their well-being, asking about the environment they live in and about how they live their lives, the type of jobs they're doing, the people they interact with. They also ask them about the type of foods they eat. They ask about the pollutants even in the environment they live in, and they ask a lot of information. They also invite the children into what are called in-focus clinics. So they ask information that can't be collected through questionnaires. And this is done every couple of years. Now these children are now 22 years old and they're still taking part in the study, and they still go into these clinics and have this information taken. So it's a massive study, and it's given us lots of really, really valuable information, and we've been able to answer a lot of questions from it. So the type of thing they have from the children, they have hair clippings for 21 years from these children, so that they could look at the impact of environmental pollutants and things like that. They've got nail clippings. Apparently there's a warehouse somewhere outside Bristol with stool samples and things like this in it, you know? So a lot of information. Sorry to lower the tone up. They've also got questionnaire data. They've also got measures of IQ, attainments. They've also got information about their friendships, about whether they tried smoking when they were 13 or not, you know, all of this sorts of information. So a really rich data source. Now, going back a few years, when these children were 11, they were asked as part of this in-focus clinic if they would mind having their physical activity monitored. And about 5,000 of them agreed. So they were given what's called an accelerometer, and I'm actually wearing one at the moment. If you can see the tiny little red thing on my waist. Can people see that at the back there? Okay. It's maybe about yay big squared. Okay. So it's a very small device, and it basically monitors your activity. So we asked the children to wear this for a week to try and get a snapshot of the type of activity that they were doing. So it tells you frequency and it tells you duration. So we could see if children were running for 20 minutes, or if they were walking slowly, or if they were lying around. And they wore this for about a week just to try and get a rough idea of the type of activity that they were doing. Now, we were also lucky enough to be able to link to their school records. Now, these children were based in and around Bristol, so they have to take part in these nationally administered school assessments known as SATs. And these were done when the children were 11, when they were 13, and then when they were about 15, 16 years old. So this was their GCSEs, the equivalent of our standard grades in Scotland. And we were able to get this information, which meant we could look to see if there was a relationship between the physical activity they were doing and how they were doing at school. And it's important to take in mind that both of these measures are objective measures. So we weren't asking them what they were doing, we were taking the most scientific measure possible. Now, given the really wide range of other information that we had from this group, we were able to take into account lots of factors. So we were looking to see if there was a relationship between physical activity and attainment, when we even took into account their parents' education level, what their parents did for a job. We took into account how much oily fish the mothers ate when they were pregnant, because that's been known to be linked to brain development of the fetus. We also looked at pubertal status because that has an impact on how kids are doing at school. We took into account how much the mother had smoked. What else? We also looked at birth weight, length of gestation, age of mother, so this really wide range of factors. And what we found was that there was a positive relationship between physical activity and children's academic attainment, even when we took into account all of these other factors. So to explain a bit more about the results then, we found that the higher the levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity, so the more of this intense activity the children were doing, the better they were doing at school, when these points were taken both at 11 years old. However, we found that this was still the case when their attainment was looked at 13. So the activity they did at 11 still had an impact on their attainment 2 years later. And also then when we looked at their GCSE grades. So how much physical activity they were doing at 11 years old still had a positive beneficial effect on their school grades 5 or 6 years later. So it's a really long-term impact of this moderate to vigorous physical activity while we're taking into account this massive array of controlling factors. Now, it's quite an abstract thought, so to put it in some sort of terms, what we found was that for roughly every 15 minutes activity the children were doing, they would get an additional quarter of a grade of a GCSE point. So if they would do an extra half an hour, they would go up half a grade. So if you were sitting at C, potentially they could go up to a B if they were doing an additional half an hour of physical activity. Now that might not sound very much, but it's important to bear in mind that these kids were doing quite low levels of physical activity to begin with. So the average levels for boys was only 29 minutes daily of this moderate to vigorous physical activity. And for girls, it was only 18 minutes. So they were doing really low levels of activity. And still we were finding, after controlling for all these factors, that there was beneficial effect of higher levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So in terms of the literature, this is quite an important finding, and it answers quite a lot of the questions that had been bandied around as being problems in the literature before.